There's a lot to cover today. I'm looking forward to sharing a ton of new features in zForm 2.3. It's the biggest release since version 2.0. If you want to skip around to different parts of the video, I'll include timestamps for each of the sections. There will be a quick overview of each of the features, as well as a variety of short tutorials, but they'll specifically be on how to use the new features being released in zForm. Let's get started. I'm going to start by sharing that there's an entirely new documentation page for zForm. Everything from installing and uninstalling, updating to a new version, the user interface, the main features and how to use each feature, utility tools, tips and tricks, and a link at the bottom for the newest updates, which takes you to another page to see over time all the updates with zForm. I'll make sure to include a link in this video as well as a link in my product page. If you have any questions about using the tool, feel free to reach out. Let's now cover a few changes in the user interface. You'll notice the input type in the very top. I used to have image, video, and directory as buttons at the top. I've changed it to a dropdown. The main reason for this is scaling. I plan to have more input types in the future. It seems more intuitive to me. The input type works exactly as it did before. You would just use the dropdown to select which type you want to use, whether it's an image, a video, or a directory. And the aesthetics of the tool look a little bit different than the previous versions. I tried to clean things up a little bit. You'll also notice a couple new sections. One is called texture properties. This one is loaded with a bunch of new features. You now have more control over the behavior of the depth map. For instance, you can adjust the cropping, the contrast colors, the brightness, color space. So if you wanted to switch from non-RGB to sRGB for a color depth map instead of grayscale, and then change the values of red, green, or blue. Another exciting thing is the depth map painting feature. When it's enabled, you'll be able to paint over your depth map. There's also a few fun presets at the top. The first one for shadow box will convert your mesh into a shadow box. The second one for box will create a box around your mesh. This can be useful if you want to create a tile for something like a terrain, or if you want your main object to have a flat surface on the bottom for 3D printing. And it can also be useful to speed up the workflow of removing the backside of the mesh. I'll be covering all of these in more detail. The other new section is called Utility Tools. It's down at the very bottom below Apply All Modifiers. The very first utility tool is exporting an animation. Let's say that you use the input type video or directory, both of which leverage Blender's timeline and generate a mesh frame by frame. You'll now be able to export that into a GLB or glTF file. The way it works is it will convert your mesh into shape keys, and then in step 2, you'll export. The second section for export single mesh isn't currently a tool, but I did list out some of the important things you want to consider before you export your mesh. There's also a new feature in mesh properties. It's called Deform Mesh. So when you enable it, it looks like that. You have the option to bend, twist, taper, and stretch your object along the Z, X, or Y axis. It's really nifty. I'll be showing you how to use this tool. And then if you expand out material properties, there's a new UV scaling section, and I'll talk more about the set box UVs. The reset UVs will just reset the UVs back to default. All right, let's give these new features a try. If you have questions about installing or upgrading to a new version of zForm, please reference my documentation page. I do cover that in detail. The first thing I'm going to do is expand all at the top. Then I'm going to import the image, which is this one here. Then I'm going to import the corresponding depth map, which is this one, and scroll all the way down to the bottom and click Apply Depth Map. I'm going to zoom in a little bit and rotate along the Z axis like this, just to see what it looks like. And it looks okay. I'm going to zoom in a little bit more, rotate Z, and I think the depth is a little too much. So I'm going to adjust the depth down from 1 to 0.4, and then take a look in solid mode, and it looks okay. I'm actually going to increase the subdivision from 8 to 9. Okay, so that gives us a little more detail. I do see a little bit of banding on this area here, but that can happen sometimes with 8-bit images. If you increase the subdivision level too much, I'm okay with that. Now what I'm going to do is collapse everything and then go under Mesh Properties and enable Deform Mesh. That's going to create a new sphere object. We're going to use this new sphere to be the origin point when we're deforming our mesh. It'll be easier to understand once I start showing you some of the techniques. Also, at any time, you can hide it by pressing H. Then you can go to the right side, and there's a little eye. Right now it's hidden. You can click that on again and view it at any time. And then you can select the sphere again as well, which we're going to do. All right, now look at the deform type. There are 4 different options, one for twist, one for bend, taper, and stretch. We're going to start with bend as the first one. And we'll also start with z-axis as the bend. The tool will automatically set the deform object as the sphere. And to show you what it does, I'm going to go to the top view now. And then under angle, I'm going to drop this down to negative. And you'll start to see the bending of the object like that. Okay, so let's go back into front view again. And it starts bending the object. Okay, so then now I'm going to go back into the material preview and take a look. And I'm going to hide the sphere real quick. Let me scroll in a little bit and then take a look. It looks okay. And then rotate it on the Z. Okay, it's a little bit slow because of subdivision level. I might drop down the subdivision to 8 just to show you how this works. Okay, so now I'm going to rotate a little bit like that. It looks pretty good. So I'm going to go back to the top view again and unhide the sphere. I'm going to select the sphere and move the sphere on the y-axis. Then you'll see that it starts stretching out the mesh a little bit. Okay, so let me go back into the front view and then move it along the y again. You see how it's stretching? Of course, there are times when it's not going to look good, but I want to show you that you can do that. You can also stretch the original object by pressing S. And let's say I wanted to stretch this on the Z-axis. I'd press Z, and then it'll stretch it up like that. I'm going to press Escape, though, and go back to where it was. Now I'm going to increase the angle to a negative, let's say, 180. And then I'm going to move the UV sphere, again, forward to stretch it out. GY, like that here. Now it looks a little bit more interesting. The stretching looks terrible, so I'm going to go scale Z to go up like that, so maybe like that, and then take a look again. It's probably a little too much for this example, but it shows you what it's capable of doing. If at any time you want to undo all the bending, you would just uncheck the deform mesh. And then it goes back to what the original is. Keep in mind we did stretch this object. It was more of a landscape. Because of that, I'm going to actually start over again. We're going to try the x-axis now. Now I'm going to go into side view, decrease the angle, and then take a look at the mesh. You see how it's bending? This time it's bending along the x-axis. Okay, I'm going to go back into the front view again and hide the UV sphere. All right. Looking good. Let me go back into the side again and lower the angle to -90. I'm going to unhide our UV sphere and select it. Take a look when I move the UV sphere around, what it does to the mesh. Okay, I'm going to move it on the y-axis and see how it's expanding it out like that. We'll go back into front view. Now I'm going to select the main mesh and scale it along the x-axis. So I'm going to press SX. And scale it like that, maybe about right there, and then take a look again. You get the idea. There's a lot you can do with this. I realize the bending can stretch the original material a little too much. In that case, you can drop it down. I'm doing -90, so let's say if we did -10, it might look a little bit better. It's really up to you. I do think this can be quite useful when making slight adjustments rather than extreme. I'm going to show you one more example for deform mesh. Change the deform type from bend to taper. Decrease the value factor just a little bit. The way I'm doing that is holding my shift on my keyboard and then moving it just slightly. And then pay attention to what it's doing to the mesh. As I decrease it, it's tapering the top. And then I'm going to increase it and it's going to taper the bottom. This can be quite useful sometimes. Now I'm going to change the axis from Z to X and then see what it does if you change the X. And then let's also do the same thing for Y. Change it to Y and then decrease and increase. This one is a little bit weird. I'm going to go into the side angle here and then decrease and increase. See how it does that. The Y could be helpful sometimes if you need to adjust the floor or the ceiling. All right, I'm gonna decrease this back to 0 again, and then go back into the front. The best way to understand how these work is just to give it a try for yourself. All right, let's move on to something else. Open and import the image. So this is a dog here. Then I'm gonna import the corresponding depth map, which is this one here. Then I'll scroll all the way down to the bottom and click Apply Depth. And this is what the dog looks like. Let me go into solid mode. Here's what the dog looks like in solid mode. A few things I want to point out. The first is these annoying ridge lines that can happen in 8-bit images sometimes in the background of the mesh. We're going to fix that using the paint tool. And the second is this unwanted fold at the very top. Let's fix that first. I'm going to collapse everything and then expand out the texture properties section. You'll notice one feature, it's called mapping extension. Change that from repeat to extend, and that will remove the unwanted fold at the top. Now, scroll down to the depth map painting section and enable depth painting. Make sure to do this after you've originally generated the mesh. There's one important thing I need to call out if you use the depth map painting feature. What it ends up doing is editing your original depth map. If you end up saving this .blend file, it will prompt you to modify and save over the original depth maps. Because of that, I strongly recommend you back up your original depth maps and place them in another directory so that it doesn't mess them up. Click on the paint mode, this button here. You'll be taken into what's called image editor mode, specifically paint mode. And if you're using Blender 4.3 or above, you should see some brush assets at the bottom. Another thing is if you don't see the sidebar menu on the right, just type in N on your keyboard. Another thing I want to point out is if you're using Blender 4.2 or below, I believe the default options for brushes are very limited. I would recommend using Blender 4.3 or above if you want to use the paint feature in zForm. I'm going to shrink the sidebar a little bit. Next, we're going to paint over the outer scene of the depth map. This is a very nifty tool. For the brush option, make sure you choose Fill. Then, to start with, click only once in the back part of the scene, and you'll see it got darker. I'm going to click again. It gets darker. I'm going to keep clicking until it goes all the way dark like that. And then I'm going to remove the bottom left object here by clicking just like did before. And it's all gone. Now let's go back to our main work area. You do that by clicking the top left and choose 3D viewport. And there you go. And what we did was paint over the depth map. Let's say instead you wanted to use a different brush. Click on the reset button, and that will reset the texture. Then go back into paint mode. And for this one, I want to select the erase hard brush. Then for strength, I'm going to increase it to 1 and start painting over the back part of the scene like that. And it's going to look pretty bad, but you get the idea. You can be more precise and remove parts of the depth map you want. Now let's go back into 3D viewport again. And there you go. I'm going to reset the texture again like that. Next is one of my favorites, the shadow box. We're going to use this character here. This is what it looks like in solid mode. Go to the top of texture properties and there'll be a shadow box button in the top left. Click on that button and there you go. It's a shadow box. Keep in mind you can adjust any of the other settings like your depth strength in real time if you want. Here's what it looks like on the side. I know it's not a fully enclosed box, but it's pretty easy for you to do. If you're really interested in knowing how to do that, I can add a little instruction tutorial in my documentation page. There's one more thing we need to do. We need to fix the UVs. Let me show you in material mode. Scroll up just a little bit in material properties section. If you don't have it open, just expand it and then go down to UV scaling. There'll be a button that says set box UVs. And what this will do is set the UVs for the shadow box as well as this other box that I'm going to talk about in just a minute. You might need to fix the outer part of the shadow box because it does repeat the material, but the inner side will match with the shadow box. At any time, you can click on the reset UVs and it will reset the UVs back to the default. And if you don't want to use the shadow box, all you need to do is click the reset and it will reset the texture properties back to default. Now we'll try the box preset. I'm going to open up a new image, and this time it's going to be a terrain, and the terrain looks like this here. Then I'm going to open up the depth map, which is this one, and I'm going to click apply depth. So this is what the terrain looks like, and here's what it looks like in solid mode, like that. Then I'm going to click on the box preset, and it turns it into a box like that. I'm actually going to drop down the depth a little bit from 0.6 to 0.45, like that. Now back in texture properties, go down to the color section, adjust the contrast up. The max is 2, but you can see how much a difference it can make when you adjust this up or down. And then we can go back down to 0, which is entirely gone, and then go all the way back up to 2 again. So I'm going to adjust this to like 1.7, like that. Looks pretty neat for a terrain. The other thing is when we have our box like this, although this is not a new feature, we can cut out the bottom side of the mesh and make it into a fully enclosed cube. Let me show you how to do that right now. I'm going to enable use background removal. And then I'm going to scale this background removal cube down by pressing S and Z to scale it down on the Z axis. Then I'm going to press GZ to go down. I want to cut out the bottom side like that. I'm going to go into side view just to see if it fits everything. And then the top view. Ooh, the top view, I'm going to scale this up just a little bit like that. Then I'm going to select my main object again and use the eyedropper and select the empty background cube object like that. And it will cut out the bottom side of the mesh so it's a full solid cube like this. It doesn't always work perfectly. There are times when you need to adjust this empty background cube. Just keep that in mind. I do have some other videos about that. Another thing I want to point out with this example is let's change the color space from non-color to sRGB. And you'll see that the terrain changed just by changing the color space. Let's switch it to Rec 1886. That also changed a little bit. And then lastly, Filmic sRGB. You'll see these weird extensions going really, really high. I'm going to switch it back to non-color. Now what I notice is when using the color space, it works for 16-bit. It doesn't work so well with 8-bit. I don't know the reason why. If anybody has any answers about that, please let me know. The last thing real quick is if you were going to change this to sRGB and you had a color depth map, not grayscale, if you had a color, then you could adjust the red, green, and blue value, and that should narrow down to specific parts of the depth map based on the color. I haven't fiddled with this one a whole lot, but it does actually work. There's one more feature I want to share with you in texture properties called crop. The first thing I need to do in mapping extension is change it from extend to repeat. Then I'm going to turn this character here into a 3x3 repeated grid. I'm going to increase the max to 3 and then increase the Y by 3. And there you go. You can of course change each one individually like this and this here like that. Looks a little bit weird, but I'm sure there's going to be times where you can use it and then adjust it like that. I'm going to go back to 1. 1 is the default for max X and max Y. This could come in handy sometimes. Last but not least is exporting an animation. At the very bottom, there's a new section, Utility Tools. And there are 2 options, one for export animation and one for export single mesh. We're going to focus on export animation, so expand it out. There'll be 2 steps involved. The first step is converting your animation to shape keys. And then the second step will export as GOP or a glTF file. Before we can do those steps, we actually need to generate the animated mesh. So I'm going to go all the way up to the top. There are 2 options. The first is using a video file, and the corresponding depth maps are also a video file. Or we could use a directory, which will use a directory of images and their corresponding depth maps that are also images. And that will also create an animation. We're going to go with this option. This gives me a good opportunity to show a little bit better on how the directory feature works. I'm going to expand all, up here on the top right. Then I'm going to specify the directory where all the images are. In this case, it's frames of a video, and it's this directory here. Then I need to specify where my depth maps are for each of the frames. It's important that there's underscore depth at the end when using the directory feature. That way it can find the original files. I'm going to click accept at the bottom right. Okay, you might be wondering what the depth maps look like, and I'm going to show that to you right now. This woman is dancing, she's got her headphones on, and she's holding her audio device. You'll see that frame by frame, there is some flickering that goes on, and that is one challenge of generating depth maps for a video, is maintaining consistency frame by frame, because the depth map models are an estimation. It's not precise for each frame. There are a few newer models at this time that can help with maintaining consistency frame by frame, but it still is a challenge. The depth map model I used was depth anything v2, and the model weights file is small. I used the max resolution size of 512, and one other important thing that I did was generate 16-bit depth maps instead of 8-bit. If you're curious about how I created the depth maps using my own tool, Depth Map Batch, I'll include a short little tutorial at the very end of this video and timestamp links in the description. Alright, let's continue. Scroll all the way down and then click Apply Depth, and that will apply the depth maps for each of the frames. One thing I want to point out is I could increase the subdivision level to something like 9 or even 10, but it slows things down quite a lot when I'm trying to show a demo. I'm going to drop it back down to 8 for subdivision to help with performance. Now I'm going to expand out the timeline at the bottom here. Using my keyboard, I'm going to use the right arrow to go to each frame. And you'll see that each frame has a different mesh, and that's corresponding to the image and the depth map. Press play using the spacebar, and you'll see it's an animation. Okay, I'm going to stop it and go back to the first frame again. We've now only got a few steps left. So scroll down all the way to the bottom and expand out utility tools. I'm going to minimize the timeline. In utility tools, expand out export animation again. There's one critical first step. We need to enable a native add-on called glTF 2.0 format. So under add-ons and preferences, search for glTF, and you should see it right here, glTF 2.0 format. Make sure that's checked on and enable them, and then close out preferences window, and then we can continue. First thing is make sure that you select your animation object, which I have selected right now. Then in step 1, specify how many frames you want. I'm only going to do 50, and I'll explain why in just a minute. And then the step 2, we would just click export animation. But first we need to do step 1. When the final file is exported as either GLB or glTF, the size of the file can be quite large. For example, in this case with only 50 frames, I believe around 2 gigs. Okay, we're getting pretty close. The next thing you're going to do is just click on Convert to Shape Keys. A little window will pop up just to confirm your start and end frame, and then click OK. And this might take a little bit of time, especially if you have like 50 or 100 frames or even bigger. Also keep in mind it depends on how dense the mesh is, like subdivision level. Okay, that didn't take too long. Now on the right side, if you expand out the view layer, you'll see a new object, and it's got underscore shape keys at the end, which is your shape keys object. Make sure to keep that selected. And then the very last step is click on export animation, but choose if you want GLB or glTF. I'm going to use GLB, and then click on export animation. I'll just rename it dance animation, and then click export animated glTF. And once you click export, this could take a little bit more time. Okay, so we've got our exported GLB file. Now we want to test importing it back into Blender. So I'm going to close out Blender entirely. Then I'm going to open up Blender again. And then in my download section, I'm going to find the new GLB file that we just exported and then drag it into Blender 4.3 and then click import glTF 2.0. All right, so now it's in the Blender scene. I'm going to press play, and it works, which is really cool. Keep in mind it's only 50 frames. There are a few limitations that I ran into when exporting animations as GLB or glTF files. Based on Blender's documentation, only certain types of animations are supported, including keyframes, shape keys, armatures, skinning, and animations of other properties like materials. For example, a video file that has frames and materials for each frame, that will be ignored. Also, when it comes to something like booleans, let's say you remove the backside of the mesh using a boolean, that's also not supported. I did spend quite a decent amount of time trying to figure out an alternative, but at this time I don't have a good solution. There is one idea that I've been exploring. My biggest concern is the file size. I do think it's going to be enormous, a lot bigger than even this, so I've been hesitant on providing that as a solution. I don't think it's the best solution out there. For those that have made it this far in the video, thank you very much. I really appreciate your time. I realize this is a pretty lengthy video. I tried my best to make it as concise and compact as possible, but it was a real challenge, given all the important information I wanted to include and cover with all the updates with zForm 2.3. There's only one last thing in the video, which is a mini tutorial on how I generated my depth maps using depth map batch. Other than that, that's it. What I do is choose the input method. In this case, it's video. Then I choose the video file, and it's this one here. Then I choose the depth map style, which is 16-bit. And then I choose the model that I'm going to use. In this case, I'm using depth anything v2 small, which is the smallest of the three models. Then I choose the max resolution size. Because the video file is several hundred frames, I'm going to use a low max resolution size of 512. You can increase it quite a bit. The higher that you increase the max resolution size, the longer it can take. Typically, if I'm using a directory of images that's, let's say, less than 50 for a single image, then I try to go with 1200. Anything above that can take my machine quite a long time. And lastly is just providing where you want to save your depth maps. So here's my directory that I'm going to save my depth maps. I just click accept and then just click start and open up the directory. It's this one here. It will still take a little while, but it's much faster using the depth anything v2 small and the max resolution size of 512. All right, so you get the idea of how that works.